In 2024, a historian's routine archive search in rural South Carolina uncovered a daguerreotype from 1852, a family portrait that would unravel one of the South's most deliberately buried conspiracies. The Wright family, prominent plantation owners and respected community leaders, had meticulously erased evidence of their involvement in forced breeding programs and systematic abuse spanning 3 decades. For over 170 years, official records remained silent. But a single photograph, hidden in a courthouse basement among water-damaged legal documents, sparked an investigation that would expose not just family crimes, but institutional complicity spanning generations, state lines, and involving networks of physicians, lawyers, and fellow plantation owners who had profited from the commodification of enslaved women's bodies. Descendants of enslaved women began piecing together fragmented oral histories that had been passed down through families in whispered conversations, kitchen table testimony, and carefully preserved diaries that had survived against all odds. Unmarked graves were discovered on the property during archaeological surveys. Genetic testing revealed patterns of forced paternity, and the Wright family's carefully constructed legacy, built on philanthropy, judicial appointments, and historical revisionism, crumbled under the weight of undeniable proof. This is the story of how one image broke through the walls of historical silence, how a single photograph transformed oral memory into documented fact, and how the ground itself refused to remain silent about the crimes buried beneath it. Chapter 1. The photograph emerges. The archive was cold and dimly lit, as most archives are, a place where forgotten things go to stay forgotten, where boxes of courthouse records accumulate dust and bureaucratic indifference in equal measure. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been searching for property deeds, mundane documentation of land transfers in the South Carolina Low Country dating to the 1840s and 1850s, when her fingers brushed against a leather portfolio wedged behind a stack of court records from 1863. The portfolio was water-damaged, its edges curled and brittle, its leather cover cracked with age. She had almost passed over it. A younger archivist might have catalogued it as damaged beyond preservation, but Mitchell had learned through 30 years of historical research that damaged materials often contained the most revelatory evidence. The documents that had been deemed worthless were sometimes the ones that had been preserved precisely because no one had thought them significant enough to destroy. Inside the portfolio lay a daguerreotype, its surface tarnished but still readable, still capable of transmitting its frozen moment across 172 years. What she saw made her breath catch, made her hands tremble enough that she had to set the photograph down on the archival table and sit for several minutes before she could trust herself to examine it further. The photograph showed 5 people arranged formally in a plantation parlor, a room the Wrights had called the Great House Parlor, where visitors from neighboring plantations were entertained with bourbon and careful conversation about crop yields and slave management. A stern-faced man in his 60s sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, his expression conveying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. This was Colonel Edmund Wright, one of the county's largest slaveholders, a man who had accumulated wealth through the systematic exploitation of at least 247 documented enslaved individuals, though the true number was almost certainly higher. To his left stood a younger woman, his second wife, Caroline, identifiable through property records that Mitchell had cross-referenced. Her expression was unreadable, the kind of controlled blankness that suggests either profound numbness or the practiced performance of respectability. Behind them, positioned as though part of the furniture, as though they were decorative elements chosen to complement the room's aesthetic rather than human beings, stood 3 young black women. Their faces bore a particular resemblance to the family seated before them, a resemblance that was far too consistent to be coincidental. Their eyes held something else that the photograph captured with haunting clarity, a kind of resignation, a knowledge of a terrible truth they could not speak, a familiarity with power structures that had rendered them essentially voiceless. What made Mitchell's hands tremble was not the photograph itself. She had seen many daguerreotypes from the antebellum South, many images that documented the casual cruelty of slavery through their formal compositions. What made her hands tremble was the notation on the photograph's verso, written in faded pencil in handwriting that matched Edmund Wright's signature on documents in the courthouse files. Edmund's breeding stock, 1852, do not distribute. The words were almost clinical in their detachment, as though the photograph documented inventory rather than human lives. The term breeding stock was one Mitchell had encountered in her research, a term used by some plantation owners to describe enslaved women whom they intended to use for forced reproduction. But seeing it written on the back of an actual photograph, seeing it as a deliberate notation by the man who had perpetrated the crimes, moved the concept from historical abstraction into visceral, documented reality. She photographed it with her phone, her hands shaking enough that the first image came out slightly blurred. She took 5 more, ensuring that the image was clearly captured. She photographed the verso with its handwritten notation from multiple angles. Then she sat in the archive's uncomfortable chair for 45 minutes, simply holding the daguerreotype and trying to process what she had found. Before leaving the archive that day, Mitchell made several phone calls. She called Marcus Thompson, a genealogist and descendant researcher, whom she had met at a regional history conference 3 years earlier. She called Dr. James Chen, an expert in plantation archaeology at the University of South Carolina. She called her department chair to request emergency funding for expanded archival research. She did not yet know how significant this discovery would become, but she understood with absolute certainty that the photograph had changed something fundamental, that a line had been crossed from speculation into documentation, from oral history into material evidence. Marcus Thompson's response, when she described what she had found, was a long silence followed by a single question. "You're certain about the notation?" When she confirmed that she had photographed it, that it was definitely Edmund Wright's handwriting, Thompson began to cry. He was a man in his 50s, a professional genealogist with decades of experience compiling family trees from fragmentary records. But he was also a descendant of individuals who had been enslaved on the Wright plantation. His great-great-grandmother had been enslaved there. His family had grown up hearing whispered stories about what had happened in the big house, stories that had been passed down through generations as a kind of inherited trauma, stories that no one had any way to verify or prove. "My family's been telling this story for 4 generations, Marcus said, his voice rough. "My great-grandmother told my grandmother told my mother told me. We never had proof. Just the story, just the memory, just the weight of it." Within 2 weeks, Mitchell had connected with 17 descendants of individuals who had been enslaved on the Wright plantation. Some lived locally, others had migrated north during the Great Migration and were now scattered across New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. But all of them had family stories, fragmented, whispered, sometimes dismissed as exaggeration or bitterness, about what had happened in the big house, about women who had disappeared for months and returned pregnant, about children who had been born and separated before they could walk, about a systematic exploitation that had been so carefully hidden that it had become almost invisible within the larger narrative of slavery itself. Mitchell began collecting these testimonies, recording them on her phone, transcribing them, cross-referencing dates and names with archival records. What emerged was a picture of a deliberate, systematic program, not a series of individual acts of abuse, but an organized operation designed to maximize reproduction among enslaved women for profit. Chapter 2. The Silence Before the Revelation. The Wright family maintained their respectability through meticulous erasure, a practice that was not unique to them, but represented a deliberate strategy employed by many prominent slaveholding families to ensure that their crimes would not survive in the historical record. Colonel Edmund Wright died in 1887, outliving Reconstruction by 2 decades, living just long enough to see the South's social hierarchy partially restored through Jim Crow legislation, but not before ensuring that his private correspondence was destroyed. He had left detailed instructions in his will that certain documents were to be burned, instructions that his executors followed with the same unquestioning obedience that he had demanded from enslaved people during his lifetime. His plantation records, the ledgers that would have documented transactions, punishments, medical procedures, and forced pregnancies, were systematically destroyed in 1889 by his son, James, during a fire that consumed the plantation's administrative building. The local newspaper reported it as an accident. Tragic conflagration destroys historic records. But descendants who had been present that day, who had been enslaved or semi-free workers on the property, remembered it differently. They remembered watching men carry crates of documents to the fire. They remembered the deliberateness of it, the methodical nature of the destruction. The fire had not been accidental. It had been carefully orchestrated to eliminate evidence. By the middle of the 20th century, the Wright family narrative had been successfully reconstructed. They positioned themselves as tragic products of an institution they had not created, merely participated in, a framing that conveniently erased individual agency and deliberate cruelty. Edmund Wright became, in local histories, a man of his time, a formulation that suggested he was somehow less responsible for his actions because those actions had been socially acceptable within his context. It was a formulation that erased the distinction between passive participation and active criminality, between people who had profited from slavery reluctantly and people like Edmund Wright, who had systematized and optimized exploitation. By the late 20th century, Wright descendants had become lawyers, judges, and philanthropists. They funded libraries that controlled what historical materials were preserved and what materials were discarded. They served on historical society boards that determined which narratives were presented to the public and which narratives were deemed too controversial or divisive to be properly explored. They shaped the very institutions that determined what was remembered and what was forgotten. One Wright descendant, Margaret Wright Sterling, had served as chair of the County Historical Society for 18 years. During her tenure, the society had carefully avoided any deep investigation into plantation records or the systematic abuses that had occurred on Wright family properties. In the county itself, the silence was enforced not through active suppression, but through a kind of collective amnesia, an agreement, unspoken but deeply understood, that certain things simply were not discussed in polite society. Descendants of enslaved people lived in the same communities as Wright descendants. They passed each other on the street. They saw the Wright family name on buildings, the Edmund Wright Memorial Library, the Wright Family Pavilion in the county park, the Wright Scholarship Fund at the local university. They saw these names and knew what they represented, but they also knew the futility of challenging a narrative that had been institutionally sanctioned and legally protected. The knowledge of what had happened was preserved in oral tradition, a form of memory that was simultaneously powerful and fragile, simultaneously authentic and vulnerable to dismissal. Stories were passed between women in kitchens while they prepared meals. They were whispered to children at bedtime as warnings about the persistence of injustice. They were shared among descendants who had inherited not only genetic material, but psychological trauma, an inherited grief for relatives they had never met, grief that had no name in official history, grief that had been passed down through generations as a kind of ancestral wound. But oral history carries no weight in a courtroom. It requires no apology. It can be dismissed as embellishment or bitterness or the distortions introduced by time and the imperfections of memory. A descendant could speak to the trauma that had shaped her family, could articulate the specific ways that forced breeding and family separation had fractured her lineage, but that testimony would always be vulnerable to the counter-argument that she could not possibly know these things with certainty, that she was relying on stories that might be distorted or exaggerated. The official historical record was pristine and almost completely empty of relevant information. Wright plantation records, when referenced at all in county histories, mentioned approximately 247 enslaved individuals in a passing reference, but offered no details about their lives, their fates, their relationships to one another, or the specific abuses they had endured. Births and deaths went unrecorded in any official capacity. Separations of enslaved families were not documented. The plantation operated in a kind of bureaucratic silence, leaving behind just enough paperwork to prove its existence, but not enough to prove its crimes. This was not accident. It was deliberate administrative strategy designed to create plausible deniability, while simultaneously erasing evidence that could be used to document abuse. Chapter 3. The First Cracks. Dr. Mitchell's discovery of the photograph triggered something unexpected, a cascading series of revelations as other materials, long hidden or forgotten, suddenly surfaced and became available for public scrutiny. Once word spread through genealogy networks, historical societies, and academic circles about the existence of the daguerreotype with its damning notation, other materials began emerging not through official channels, but through attics, estate sales, antiquarian dealers, and private collections. A letter was discovered in a Virginia antique shop by a dealer who recognized its historical significance. The letter was written by Edmund Wright's first wife, Catherine, in 1845, to her sister in Massachusetts. In it, Catherine expressed her horror at her husband's breeding operations, a term she used openly, without attempting to disguise its meaning. She described witnessing young women being examined by a physician in the big house, described overhearing conversations about reproductive capacity, described her own moral revulsion at what was occurring under her roof. The letter suggested that Catherine had attempted to refuse participation in the system and had been threatened by her husband. She wrote, "He has made it clear that my objections are irrelevant to his purposes. I am a wife and therefore subject to his authority in all matters. I have no power to prevent what he intends." The letter ended abruptly, mid-thought, as though Catherine had been interrupted or had decided that continuing was too dangerous. Her death, 3 years later, was recorded in local records as fever, a term that was commonly applied to deaths of unclear origin, deaths that might have resulted from illness, accident, or deliberate poisoning. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was conducted. She was simply buried in the family cemetery, her death accepted without question. Another significant discovery came from the personal papers of a neighboring plantation owner, found among materials being sold at an estate auction. These papers included a diary kept by a young overseer named Thomas Brickwell, who had worked on Wright Plantation for 7 years, beginning in 1848. The diary was confessional in tone, written as though Brickwell was attempting to exercise guilt through documentation. He described in detail the systematic rape of enslaved women and the documentation of their pregnancies. The overseer discussed specific women by name, described the methods used to coerce compliance, described the ways that resistance was punished. Most significantly, he documented the economic rationale for the program, the profits that could be generated by breeding enslaved children who could be sold or retained as labor. The overseer eventually left the South in 1855 and spent his later life in religious retreat, apparently seeking redemption for crimes he had witnessed and facilitated. In his diary, he named names. Edmund Wright's name appeared 23 times. Marcus Thompson, collaborating closely with Dr. Mitchell, began conducting in-depth interviews with elderly relatives who possessed fragmentary but consistent memories of the historical period. His great-uncle Samuel, 94 years old at the time of the interview, recalled his mother, who'd been born enslaved on the Wright plantation, speaking of 3 sisters who had been taken to the big house and returned weeks later, their expressions hollow and fundamentally changed. One had become pregnant. The child was born, but taken away almost immediately, removed from the mother's presence before she could form a lasting memory of her own baby's face. His mother never recovered from the grief. She had spent decades searching for that child through every means available to someone born enslaved and then freed during Reconstruction. Inquiries to freedmen's organizations, searches through adoption records, desperate conversations with anyone who might have information about a child born in 1852 on the Wright plantation. She never found her daughter. She died at 42, her cause listed in county records as melancholia, a diagnosis that was often applied to profound grief and depression. By the end of the 3rd month of Mitchell's investigation, she and Thompson had assembled a preliminary file containing the photograph and its notation, Catherine Wright's letter, Thomas Brickwell's diary excerpts, census data showing impossible population growth rates, property records documenting Wright's purchases of enslaved women from other plantations during specific periods that coincided with documented pregnancies, and testimonies from 17 descendants spanning multiple generations. None of this would have been possible without the photograph, the visible, tangible proof that the Wright family had been willing to document their own crimes, at least in the privacy of their own domestic spaces, at least in notations never intended for public view. Now, we invite you to leave in the comments where you're listening to this and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 4. The Historian's Investigation. Dr. Mitchell expanded her search exponentially, reaching out to archives across multiple states and developing a network of researchers dedicated to uncovering the systematic nature of forced breeding programs in the antebellum South. She was looking for anything that might corroborate the forced breeding program suggested by the photograph and confirmed by oral testimony. She suspected that the Wright operation was not unique, that it was part of a larger network of systematic exploitation. What she found was both confirmation and something more disturbing, evidence of deliberate destruction on a massive scale. In South Carolina, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama, records from major plantation operations had been systematically culled or burned. In some cases, this destruction had been documented. Former enslaved people had described watching plantation owners burn records in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. But in other cases, the destruction had been so complete that only its effects remained visible. The absence of records where records should have existed, the blank spaces in the historical archive where documentation had been carefully removed. But sometimes, documentation survived by accident, stored in the wrong place, misfiled in a courthouse basement, forgotten in an annex, filed under an obscure classification that no one thought significant enough to review. Mitchell developed a systematic approach to searching archives, looking for materials that had been filed incorrectly or that had survived through archival accident rather than deliberate preservation. She worked with archivists who understood the ways that records could be displaced or lost. She reviewed damaged materials that other researchers had rejected as unreadable, and gradually a picture emerged. She discovered a cache of letters dating from 1840 to 1860, stored in a Boston library as part of a donated collection from a 19th-century abolitionist named Reverend Nathaniel Prescott. These letters contained correspondence between plantation owners discussing breeding operations in frank, clinical terms that suggested this was not aberration, but standard practice. Edmund Wright had participated actively in this correspondence network, discussing methodology, exchanging information about the quality of young women purchased from other plantations, describing techniques for maximizing productive outcomes. In one particularly explicit letter dated 1856, Wright wrote to a plantation owner in Louisiana, "I have found that women between the ages of 13 and 20 are most amenable to the breeding program. Older women resist more actively. I recommend beginning the process young, before resistance patterns are fully formed. The medical supervision is essential. I employ Dr. Harrison from Charleston to monitor their health and ensure optimal reproductive capacity. The investment in medical care is returned many times over through increased yields." The letters revealed something else that Mitchell found deeply disturbing. These programs were not aberrations or the crimes of individual sadists. They were systematized, discussed, refined through correspondence between plantation owners who treated forced breeding as a legitimate agricultural practice. Plantation owners were in correspondence with one another about how to maximize the forced breeding of enslaved women. Physicians were consulted, paid for their expertise, and integrated into the system. Records were kept with meticulous care. The entire enterprise was documented, deliberate, and explicitly organized for profit. Mitchell also discovered a letter from Edmund Wright to Dr. Marcus Harrison, a Charleston physician, discussing the health management of his female enslaved workers and inquiring about methods to ensure productive outcomes. The language was deliberately obscure. Harrison responded with oblique references to regulation of cycles and maximum efficiency, but the meaning was unmistakable. Wright was seeking medical guidance on controlling and optimizing forced pregnancies. He was paying a licensed physician to participate in a systematic program of sexual abuse. Dr. Harrison had received payment for this work, payment that was documented in Wright's account books, payment that had been calculated as a legitimate business expense. Mitchell also uncovered census discrepancies that, when carefully analyzed, created an inescapable numerical conclusion. In the 1850 census, the Wright plantation was listed as containing 247 enslaved individuals. By 1860, the number had risen to 289, an increase of 42 individuals over a decade. In a population maintained purely through natural increase, an increase of this magnitude would have been statistically impossible. The natural increase rate for enslaved populations in the antebellum South, when maintained through normal reproduction and not supplemented by purchase, was approximately 2% annually. Over a decade, this would have resulted in an increase of roughly 55 individuals, 23%, but 42 individuals had been added to the Wright plantation during the same period. Further investigation revealed that many of the individuals added to the 1860 count were young people recorded as having been born on the plantation between 1850 and 1860, births that were never properly documented in any other source, births that had not appeared in any county records or church baptism records, births that had not been reported to tax authorities. It was as though children had materialized from nothing, as though they had been added to the count only at the point where they became economically productive enough to be formally registered as property. Mitchell hypothesized that many of these births had been infants born to enslaved mothers who had been systematically impregnated through forced relationships, and that these children had not been formally registered until they were old enough to work, a practice that would have allowed Wright to avoid documenting pregnancies while still capturing the economic value of the children once they were able to labor. The photograph, when combined with these documentary fragments and numerical anomalies, created an inescapable conclusion. Edmund Wright had operated a systematic program designed to force pregnancies among enslaved women, effectively treating his enslaved population as breeding stock, a term he himself had used in that pencil notation on the daguerreotype's verso. This was not individual criminality born of sadism or perversion. This was calculated, methodical economic optimization of a human body's reproductive capacity. Mitchell published her preliminary findings in the Journal of Southern History in early 2024. The response was immediate and polarized. Academic historians praised the rigor of her evidence and the comprehensiveness of her archival research. The American Historical Association nominated her work for scholarly recognition. But simultaneously, some Wright descendants hired prominent lawyers. The Wright family issued a statement suggesting that Dr. Mitchell had engaged in selective interpretation of historical materials. The County Historical Society distanced itself from her work. Local newspapers published op-eds questioning whether old wounds should be reopened, whether it was productive to dredge up the crimes of the past, whether focusing on slavery's horrors prevented the community from moving forward. But the evidence was now public. It could not be silenced again. The archive had been opened. The testimony had been recorded. The record had been made undeniable. Chapter 5. The Ground Speaks. In the summer of 2024, Dr. Mitchell and Marcus Thompson approached the current owners of the Wright Plantation property, which had been subdivided and sold multiple times since Reconstruction and through the subsequent decades of the 20th century. One parcel, approximately 40 acres, remained undeveloped, too remote from modern infrastructure to be easily converted to residential use, too small to be economically viable for modern agriculture. The current owners, a retired couple from Ohio who had purchased the property as an investment, were initially hesitant about allowing archaeological research. But when Thompson explained the historical significance and the potential importance of the investigation, they agreed to grant permission for a limited archaeological survey. Dr. James Chen, the archaeologist Mitchell had contacted months earlier, assembled a team of graduate students and volunteers. They began by conducting surface surveys of the property, looking for any visible markers of burial sites. Using ground-penetrating radar technology, they created detailed subsurface maps of the property. The radar imaging revealed something shocking: a concentration of what appeared to be human remains in a remote section of the property, far from the formal plantation cemetery where the Wright family and their most favored enslaved workers had been interred. What the archaeologists found beneath the soil confirmed what the oral histories had long suggested, and what the documentary evidence had begun to demonstrate. Unmarked graves, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, suggesting systematic interment rather than random burial. Using careful excavation techniques and meticulous documentation, they identified at least 37 distinct burial sites in the remote section of the property. The graves were shallow, suggesting hasty interment. Some contained fragments of clothing. Some showed evidence of having been disturbed, possibly by animals, possibly by attempts to remove evidence. Most contained human remains. Preliminary examination of the skeletal remains suggested that many of the individuals buried in the unmarked graves were young. Some graves contained remains consistent with teenagers, some with individuals in their 20s, some with children who appeared to have died in infancy. The age distribution was unusual, skewed heavily toward young individuals who would have been of reproductive or pre-reproductive age. This distribution would have been unexpected if the graves simply represented a slave cemetery. But it made perfect sense if the graves represented the casualties of a forced breeding program. Women and infants who had died during pregnancy or childbirth, children born to enslaved mothers who had died in infancy. DNA analysis was conducted on a subset of the remains where sufficient genetic material had survived the years of burial. The results were shocking in their specificity. Several of the individuals buried in the unmarked graves shared genetic markers with living Wright family descendants. Some shared genetic markers with multiple Wright family members, an inheritance pattern that would have been impossible unless those individuals shared recent common paternity. The evidence suggested that Edmund Wright had fathered children through forced relationships with enslaved women, and had then either allowed or orchestrated their deaths without proper burial, consigning them to an unmarked grave as though they were disposable, as though their lives held no value sufficient to warrant the effort of proper interment. The discovery made national news. The New York Times ran a front-page article titled "Archaeology Reveals Systematic Breeding Program at Antebellum Plantation." CNN featured a segment on the investigation. Documentarians began calling Dr. Mitchell and Marcus Thompson, requesting interviews and discussing potential projects. The Smithsonian Institution expressed serious interest in mounting a traveling exhibition about forced breeding programs and their long-term consequences. NPR produced a podcast series exploring the intersection of genetic evidence, archaeological findings, and oral history in documenting slavery's hidden crimes. Descendants of enslaved people who had worked on the Wright plantation began traveling to the site to pay respects to relatives they had never known they had. Some came from South Carolina. Others traveled from the north, from cities they or their ancestors had migrated to during the 20th century. They stood at the memorial site and wept. They spoke the names of relatives they had only known through family stories. They left flowers and photographs and written tributes. The site became, in a very real sense, a pilgrimage destination, a place where the silenced dead could finally be acknowledged and mourned. Chapter 6. The Weight of Testimony. If this story has captured you, leave a like. It helps the story of the Wright family's forgotten victims reach more people. Dr. Mitchell conducted extensive in-depth interviews with descendants over the course of 6 months, recording their testimonies on video and audio, creating a permanent archive of their words. What emerged was a collective memory, fragmented but consistent, specific but diverse, of systematic abuse that extended across generations, that had shaped family structures and psychological inheritance patterns, that continued to impact descendants who had never personally experienced slavery, but who carried its trauma in their bones and in their inherited narratives. Women had been taken to the big house. Some had returned pregnant. Some had not returned at all. Children born on the plantation bore genetic markers of Wright family members, but were never acknowledged as family. They were worked as enslaved people, despite carrying the blood of their enslavers. They were subjected to the same treatment as other enslaved individuals, denied the protection that might theoretically have been extended to biological relatives, treated instead as property whose value derived from their labor capacity. One descendant, an elderly woman named Dorothy Hayes, shared her grandmother's account of being 13 years old when she was separated from her family and placed in the care of Edmund Wright's wife. Dorothy's grandmother had never explicitly described what had happened to her during that period. The memory was too painful, too traumatic to be articulated directly. But Dorothy's grandmother had become pregnant at 14. She had given birth alone, in a cabin far from the main plantation structures, without medical assistance or family support. The child had been taken from her before she could form a lasting memory of its face. Her grandmother had spent the rest of her life searching for that child through every means available to someone born enslaved and then freed during Reconstruction. Inquiries to freedmen's organizations, searches through adoption records, conversations with anyone who might have information about a child born in 1852 on the Wright plantation. The search had consumed her. It had shaped her entire life, given it a singular, tragic purpose. She never found her child. The wound had never healed. The grief had never dissipated, and it had been passed down to subsequent generations. To Dorothy's mother, who had grown up listening to stories of her grandmother's lost child. To Dorothy herself, who had inherited this grief as a kind of ancestral trauma. Dorothy wept as she spoke about her family's history. She was weeping not only for her grandmother, but for all the women whose bodies had been treated as vessels for the Wright family's economic expansion. She was weeping for a capacity for cruelty that had seemed so systematic, so deliberate, so designed to maximize profit while minimizing the humanity of the victims. Similar testimonies emerged from other families. Marcus Thompson collected 73 separate interviews with descendants. A pattern became visible, consistent across families and across time. Women who had been systematically abused and then disposed of, either through separation, death, or forced migration away from their children. Descendants who had inherited not only genetic material, but psychological trauma. Inherited grief for relatives they had never met, grief that had no name in official history, a grief that had been passed down through generations as a kind of ancestral wound that shaped how they understood their own identities, their own bodies, their own capacity for trust and safety. One descendant, Michael Johnson, described how his family had been haunted by an unnamed absence. His maternal line could be traced only to his great-great-grandmother, whose origins were unclear. She had appeared in records only after emancipation, with no documented past prior to freedom. The family assumed she had been born enslaved somewhere, but they had no way of knowing where, no way of tracing her lineage, no way of naming her parents or siblings. Mitchell's investigation and the genealogical research conducted by Thompson revealed that Michael's great-great-grandmother had almost certainly been born on the Wright plantation, probably as the result of forced reproduction, probably to a woman who had died during or shortly after the birth. The discovery of this connection was simultaneously liberating and devastating. Liberating because it provided a name and a narrative, devastating because it revealed the specific mechanism of violence that had shaped his family's origins. Another descendant, Sarah Williams, described how the forced breeding program had fractured her family tree in ways that were only now becoming visible. DNA testing revealed that multiple individuals whom the family had believed to be unrelated actually shared significant genetic material with Wright family descendants. The genetic evidence suggested a pattern of rape and forced reproduction that had been systematic enough to create measurable biological connections across families. Sarah described the experience of learning this as simultaneously validating and deeply disturbing. It validated what her family had always known, that violence had been done, that her ancestors had been violated, that the trauma was real. But it also confronted her with the visceral reality of that violence in a way that oral history alone never could. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. In late 2024, after months of mounting pressure from descendants, historians, and civil rights organizations, the Wright family issued a statement. It was carefully crafted by lawyers, reviewed by a public relations firm, and designed to achieve several simultaneous objectives: to acknowledge enough of the historical record to avoid appearing completely obstructive, to stop short of explicit admission of systematic rape, to position the family as tragic figures caught in historical circumstances beyond their control, and to offer a monetary settlement that would theoretically provide reconciliation while maintaining family reputation. The statement read, "We acknowledge that certain historical practices inconsistent with modern values may have occurred on plantation properties operated by ancestors of our family. We recognize the pain that these historical events have caused to descendants of enslaved individuals. We are committed to supporting education about this difficult period of American history and to creating opportunities for healing and reconciliation. The family announced the creation of a historical reconciliation fund of $500, a sum that, when divided among the documented descendants, amounted to approximately $13,500 per identified victim. The calculation itself felt obscene in its specificity, as though a precise price could be assigned to a human life, to the trauma of forced reproduction, to the grief of separated families. The statement stopped short of explicitly acknowledging the forced breeding program. It used passive language. Practices occurred, rather than "we committed systematic rape." It positioned the Wright family as products of their time rather than as active architects of cruelty. It expressed regret in abstract terms while avoiding the concrete admission of specific crimes. For many descendants, the statement felt inadequate in ways that extended beyond the insufficiency of monetary compensation. Yes, $13,500 was insulting when considered as payment for a human life, for a body violated repeatedly, for children separated at birth. But what was more insulting was the continued refusal to name what had happened. The Wright family was still refusing to say the word rape. They were still using passive voice. They were still maintaining the fiction that they were passive participants in a historical system rather than active architects of a deliberate program of sexual violence. Some descendants rejected the fund entirely, viewing it as hush money, as an attempt to silence descendants in exchange for financial compensation that would never be adequate. Other descendants accepted the fund and donated it entirely to organizations dedicated to preserving the history of forced breeding programs and supporting descendants of slavery. A few used their portion of the reconciliation fund to finance further research into their own family histories, determined to name the relatives they had lost, to reconstruct genealogies that had been deliberately fractured. Marcus Thompson used a portion of his family's share to establish the Wright Plantation Genealogical Project, a comprehensive effort to reconstruct the family trees of individuals who had been enslaved on the plantation. Working with genealogists, archivists, and DNA testing services, Thompson was able to document more than 340 distinct individuals who had been enslaved on the Wright Plantation over its 80-year operation. For many of these individuals, the project was the first systematic attempt to preserve their names and their family connections in any official capacity. The archaeological team expanded their survey beyond the initial 40 acres. They identified and carefully catalogued 143 unmarked graves on the property and on adjacent land that had once been part of the plantation. DNA testing was conducted on those remains that could provide viable genetic samples. The results created a genealogical map of the forced breeding program, a visual representation of Edmund Wright's paternity across at least 37 documented offspring, all born to enslaved women, most of whom had died without ever being properly named in historical records, most of whom had spent their lives as undocumented property despite carrying the genetic markers of their enslaver. The investigation also revealed something unexpected. Many of the individuals whom Wright had fathered had survived. They had lived into freedom. Some had migrated north. Some had remained in the South. Their descendants were alive today, living in ordinary American communities, often unaware of the specific genetic connections that linked them to the Wright family. DNA testing brought these connections into focus, creating a genealogical reality that was sometimes uncomfortable to confront. Chapter 8. The Archival Truth. As researchers continued their investigation into the winter and spring of 2025, new documents continued to surface with remarkable regularity. as though the act of opening the archive had created permission for long-hidden materials to emerge. A cache of letters was discovered in a Boston library, part of a donated collection from a 19th-century abolitionist named Reverend Nathaniel Prescott. These letters, previously catalogued as general antebellum correspondence, contained detailed discussion of breeding operations in frank terms that shocked even historians who had become accustomed to the brutality of slavery's historical record. The letters revealed something profoundly disturbing. Edmund Wright had participated in a correspondence network with other plantation owners discussing breeding operations as though it were a legitimate agricultural practice worthy of technical discussion and optimization. Plantation owners were exchanging information about which women were most productive in terms of reproduction, discussing the efficiency of different reproductive protocols, comparing the costs and benefits of different approaches to forced reproduction. One letter, written by a plantation owner in Mississippi to Edmund Wright, read, "I have found that beginning the process at age 12 or 13 produces optimal long-term yields, though mortality rates are higher. The investment in medical supervision appears justified by the increased reproductive years. I would be interested to hear of your experience with women introduced to the program at different ages." These were not hidden documents that the participants had feared might be discovered. These were business correspondence, exchanged between professional associates discussing methodologies. The men who wrote these letters did not believe they were doing anything wrong. They believed they were engaged in a form of agricultural optimization that was no different in principle from selective breeding in livestock. Edmund Wright's replies were equally clinical. He provided detailed information about his breeding protocols, discussed the women he had selected for the program by characteristics he deemed relevant to reproduction, described the methods he used to manage resistance. He discussed the profit margins, the costs associated with medical supervision, the value of the offspring produced through forced reproduction. The letters were eventually published in a scholarly edition edited by Dr. Mitchell and accompanied by extensive commentary and historical context. The publication became widely used in university courses, taught alongside primary documents about slavery to illustrate the systematic nature of reproductive violence and the ways that educated men had rationalized and normalized crimes against humanity. The investigation also revealed something else profound. Institutional complicity was not hidden but archived. The letters had been preserved. The records had survived. The evidence had always been there. What was required to uncover it was not luck, but permission. Permission to ask difficult questions. Permission to challenge official narratives that portrayed slavery as a monolithic institution rather than as a collection of specific crimes. Permission to center the testimony of descendants over the comfort of powerful families. In the spring of 2025, a researcher working in the private papers of a prominent South Carolina attorney discovered drafts of letters suggesting that the Wright family's legal representatives had been aware of the breeding program but had deliberately not pursued prosecution or legal accountability. The evidence suggested that local legal and political authorities had conspired with the Wright family to suppress investigation into the program. Letters between the county judge and Edmund Wright's attorney discussed the importance of ensuring that sensitive family matters not become the subject of public litigation or criminal investigation. The implication was clear. Even in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, during Reconstruction, when federal authorities might theoretically have pursued charges, local elites had worked together to suppress accountability. The protection of white families' reputation and legal standing had taken precedence over any pursuit of justice for crimes against enslaved people. Chapter 9. The Testimony Preserved. The final chapter of this investigation focused not on criminal prosecution. The statute of limitations had long since passed, and the perpetrators were long dead, but on memorialization and historical preservation, on the creation of permanent records that would ensure that the truth could never again be buried in silence. Dr. Mitchell worked extensively with Marcus Thompson and with representatives from the Descendants Association to establish the Wright Plantation Archive, a comprehensive digital and physical repository of all discovered materials. The archive contained the original daguerreotype and its historical analysis, Catherine Wright's letter and scholarly commentary, Thomas Brickwell's diary, and cross-references with other contemporary sources, the correspondence between Edmund Wright and other plantation owners discussing breeding protocols, the legal documents suggesting official suppression of investigation, the census data and analysis, the property records and genealogical reconstructions, the archaeological findings and DNA analysis results, the oral testimonies recorded and transcribed, and extensive scholarly essays placing all of this evidence in historical and social context. The archive was made available both in physical form, housed at the University of South Carolina, and in digital form, accessible online to researchers and to descendants seeking to understand their own family histories. The project received funding from several foundations dedicated to racial justice and historical preservation. It became a model for how other institutions could create comprehensive records of slavery and its aftermath. A permanent memorial was erected on the site of the unmarked graves, in consultation with descendants and with careful attention to their preferences and input regarding how their ancestors should be commemorated. The memorial bore the names of 143 individuals, names reconstructed through genealogical research, archaeological analysis, DNA testing, and family oral history. Some names were approximate, pieced together from fragmentary records and probability analysis. Some were certain, drawn from documented sources. All deserved to be named, to be remembered, to be acknowledged as human beings whose lives had been stolen and whose deaths had been unwitnessed and unmoored from the rest of human community. The memorial inscription read, "In memory of those whose names were erased, whose lives were stolen and whose voices were silenced. Let this stone be a testimony to their existence and to the truth of what was done. Let their names be spoken and their memory be honored. They were not breeding stock. They were people." The memorial became a pilgrimage site, a place where descendants came to find their relatives' names, to leave flowers, to speak the names of ancestors, to participate in ceremonies of remembrance. Researchers came to study the material evidence of historical injustice and to understand how systematic violence had been architected and rationalized. Students came to understand that the history they learned in textbooks had been deliberately edited, that official records were not neutral documents, but tools of erasure designed to protect powerful families and institutions. Dr. Mitchell published her complete findings in a book titled The Wright Plantation, Documentary Evidence of a Systematic Breeding Program in the Antebellum South. The book was adopted in university courses across the country, included in graduate seminars on slavery studies, used by historians and archaeologists and genealogists as a model for how to integrate multiple forms of evidence, archival, archaeological, genetic, testimonial, into a comprehensive historical narrative. Marcus Thompson established the Voices of Wright Oral History Project, dedicated to preserving and making public the testimonies of descendants. Over 3 years, Thompson conducted more than 200 interviews with people whose families had been connected to the Wright plantation. These interviews were recorded professionally, transcribed, annotated, and made available in both archival and public formats. They became a resource used by other researchers, by descendants seeking their own family histories, by artists and writers attempting to understand the emotional and psychological weight of inherited trauma. The investigation also revealed something profound about institutional complicity and the ways that powerful institutions had collaborated to suppress knowledge and maintain social hierarchy. The suppression had not been complete. The evidence had survived, but it had been systematic and institutional enough that the truth had remained hidden for more than 170 years. Understanding that suppression was as important as understanding the original crimes. It explained how Edmund Wright could perpetrate documented atrocities while maintaining respectability. It explained how his descendants could serve as judges and lawyers and philanthropists while their family's reputation remained intact. It explained the mechanisms through which historical truth had been suppressed and forgotten. The Wright family's legal attempts to limit the historical investigation were ultimately unsuccessful. The evidence was too voluminous, too well documented, too thoroughly corroborated by multiple independent sources. The family issued no further public statements after 2024. Most Wright family members quietly distanced themselves from their ancestral history, changed their surnames, or relocated to areas where the family's historical connections were less well known. What the Wright plantation investigation ultimately revealed was that historical truth is not what is written in official records, but what is remembered in the bodies and testimonies of survivors' descendants, what is preserved in oral traditions passed down through generations, what emerges from soil and stone and the material evidence of violence. The photograph did not create the truth. It only made visible what had always existed in fragmented form, in oral traditions, in unmarked graves, in genetic inheritance. Justice delayed is not justice served, but the persistent refusal to forget is an act of resistance that honors both the dead and the living who carry their legacy.